Hi, everyone. Firstly, my apologies for the late start. I have been having laptop issues since I got home from the office, and basically took me over an hour to restart my laptop and go through updates, etc. But I'm here now, which is great. So in today's session, we will be doing Learning Unit 9. So basically the entire learning unit, it basically is part of scheduling. And then in next week's session, which is a pre-recorded session, I'll be doing Learning Unit 10, which then concludes our entire module outline. The last week of our lectures, which conclude on the 29th of May, will be a revision session. So that will be me going through sort of portions of the module outline, which I think you should be focusing on. And that will help you in the examination. I am available for questions. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Your ICE tasks all have been graded. So you will see that it is available on ARC right now, so published on ARC. I'm not 100% sure when it will be published on your student portal. I'm hoping for at least the end of this week. Then finally, your assignment 2. I'm having a little bit of a problem with the memo right now when it comes to the grading. So that's the reason why there's a slight delay with the recording, with the grading of your assignment 2. However, it should be available hopefully by next week, Tuesday. You'll have your results. I will just keep you updated if there is any changes, but so far that's where we're at. Okay, so let's dive into our content for today, which is our Learning Unit 9, Theme 1 and 2. So here we're going to speak about scheduling specifically. And we want to ask ourselves in terms of, what is short-term scheduling? So short-term scheduling, we use this predominantly from an operations space and a production space. So if you're in that sort of environment, that's where scheduling would come into play. The basics of scheduling is where you plan and control basically different resources, whether the resources is labor, whether it's machinery, whether it's materials, whatever goes into your resources for the production of product, that is what you would schedule around. And scheduling also includes a timeline, so you would need to then allocate what's your time horizon, whether it's a few hours, a few weeks, a few months, whatever the case may be. And the goal of scheduling specifically, or short-term scheduling, is you want to be able to get as much efficiency as possible. You want to minimize as much delays to try and get your product to your customer as quickly as you can. And you want to meet that customer's demand in a short period of time. You don't want to prolong it, and you don't want to cause any sort of delays. So some of the features when we're talking about scheduling is how you're going to best allocate your resource. You need to allocate the resources that is currently available, or assign them, whether it is people, so your workers, or it is equipment or machinery. You need to now allocate this to a specific task or a specific job. There's various charts that's being used, and I'll show you a chart as we go along in the session, but one of it being a Gantt chart. So you'll have a time horizon, you'll have what the job specification is, what the resources you require, etc. That's how scheduling then works. You need to also make sure that you optimize your time. So the aim of scheduling is to use your time as efficiently as you possibly can, with minimizing your downtime so that you have a good enough workflow. Also, you want to prioritize, so which means that your decisions are made on which job or task is the most important and should be completed first, based on what is the deadline of it, what is the size of your job, what resources you basically have available. If you don't have the resources available, you can't now prioritize that job because you have to wait for raw materials or other resources to come into play. So you need to prioritize according to mainly your deadline, your job size, and then what resource you then have available. Then we go into flexibility. Because it is short-term scheduling, your adjustments can be made fairly quickly and you can respond to any sort of last-minute changes, especially if your customer's demand changes. Whether you have any sort of issues in production or whether you probably don't even have a resource available, you can make a fairly quick decision when it comes to changing your schedule. Because it's short-term, it can be a lot more flexible. And then the last one is job sequencing. You want to firstly determine the order in which your job would be processed, whether it's a first come, first serve basis, whether it is the smallest or the shortest job first, or whether it is the priority job first. You need to decide what your sequence is, and then you run your production and your schedule based on that sequence. Okay. So that's basically your short-term scheduling in a nutshell. Then we go into constrained work centers, right? So constrained work centers is basically a bottleneck. It's basically in your production process or in your workstation, whatever it is within your production process that has very limited capacity compared to how much of demand you're now putting on that space, right? These basically they restrict the overall sort of throughput of the entire system because they cannot handle the required volume at the same rate as other parts of the process. So look at it as a constrained work center being a bottleneck in your production process. So some of the features when we look at a constrained work center is, number one, you probably have limited capacity. So you have maybe a slower processing rate, maybe you have limited resources like not enough people, not enough machinery, not enough equipment, which makes it now the slowest point of your workflow. So think of an assembly line. You have, let's say, 5 different units at an assembly line, and maybe at unit 3 is where you have a constrained work center. That will probably take you double the amount of time that any other workstation would take you. That's because there is a bottleneck there, because probably there's a limitation in terms of capacity. Then we talk about bottlenecks in production. So since they limit the rate at which your product or your service can flow through your production process, these work centers can often cause a lot of delays. It can cause long waiting times. It can cause a lot of inefficiency in your process, which then causes you to have a negative impact on your customer satisfaction because you cannot meet their demand at a specific time. So you need to look at it as that is what your bottleneck is then become. Then we want to see what is the impact on your throughput. So the overall sort of production capacity is determined by the output of the constrained work center. So even if all of the other parts in the process work faster and more efficient, the system is only as fast as its slowest point. And if your slowest point is at your constrained work center, that's where your system is sitting. Then we want to talk about resource prioritization. So because of the constraints, special attention must be given to scheduling and managing these sort of centers where the bottlenecks are occurring. It means you have to prioritize work, you have to reduce as much downtime as possible so that you can ensure that the bottleneck is always operating at full capacity so you get the most value out of that constrained work center. Okay. Then we're talking about your workload balancing. You want to be able to manage your constrained work center by adjusting upstream and downstream operations so that the bottleneck does not get overwhelmed with having too much of work. So you want to be able to push the work either up or down, depending where your assembly line is going. And you basically need balancing so that there's a lot more flow of the work to and from the bottleneck. All right. And then lastly, you want to talk about continuous improvement focus. So businesses now often sort of target or put a focus on these constrained work centers so that they can find better ways of improvements in terms of their processes, what resources this constrained work center needs. Maybe there's a technology upgrade that's required, anything that can help to alleviate the bottleneck and increase the overall system capacity. That is what, would basically be required to do. Okay, so that's constrained work centers, and it's also something that is quite self-explanatory if you really put your mind and focus into if there is a bottleneck or a constrained work center at a specific point in your process, production process, then how do you now handle it? What is the key aspects? What is the different techniques that you would require, etc.? Then we want to talk about the limitations when it comes to scheduling. So the first one is your uncertainty in your inputs. So basically, many of your scheduling techniques, etc., they rely on what your forecasted demand is. So what the business is forecasting the demand to be, or how long it takes the task to be completed, which may not always be accurate. So sort of different changes in customers' orders can disrupt a schedule. So here you have a bit of uncertainty because your forecast is an input and you don't know what is causing the change. Then you never know when you may have an equipment failure. If it's anything from an unforeseen circumstance or breakdown, equipment malfunction, maintenance, etc., it can throw you off your entire schedule. And then also if you don't have the labor available, if there's absenteeism, maybe your staff that you currently have don't have the right skill set, or your workforce fluctuates quite often, all of this can affect the ability to execute your plan, your schedule as you want to plan it. All right. Then we want to talk about complexity. So firstly, if you have a lot of jobs, so a large number of jobs that you're now pushing through a production process, and your constraints now increase, it becomes a lot more complex for your scheduling. So you need to use a lot of techniques like your Gantt charts, maybe some sort of linear programming, in order for you to sort of maintain it and balance it out from a large scale operations perspective, where you require more software and advanced scheduling. You can't just look at it from a simple, smaller job perspective. It needs to be considered to be quite large, especially if you're doing a number of different jobs. Then we want to speak about the lack of flexibility. So when we're speaking about lack of flexibility, we want to talk about quite a rigid schedule. So some techniques, whether it's a fixed schedule or a static schedule, they don't allow for any changes once your schedule is set. Whereas if you're in a like sort of a dynamic environment where conditions changes, you can have, based on the lack of flexibility, it can cause inefficiency within your business. So because the scheduling is quite tight and you can't change it, unfortunately, it can cause inefficiencies in your business. And when we're speaking limitations, we're speaking on a disadvantage perspective. And then the last one, we're going to talk about resource constraints, which is more speaking from a bottlenecking perspective, where your scheduling methods may not always account for, constrained resources or bottlenecks effectively. So you can have delays, you can have an unbalanced workload. So you're not saying that if 3 has a constrained work center in your schedule, you're basically still giving a time horizon to your schedule as there's no bottlenecks. And this can be a huge constraint that can cause a lot of inefficiency and a lot of downtime within your business. Okay. Then, as I spoke about before, we were talking on Gantt charts. And this is basically what a Gantt chart is. And when we're speaking about this, it is a visual representation of how a project starts to how it's then finished, and it shows how your tasks overlap when each task should be completed and when tasks are basically dependent on one another. All right. So in this specific example itself, we want to look at a Gantt chart, probably in a if you can see here, it's got different phases, your phase 1, phase 2, right down to phase 5. And it starts off smaller. It starts off with what is the assessment like? Basically, what's your job supposed to be? How many jobs, etc. Who's the people that's now involved from a stakeholding perspective? How much of money is now involved from a budgeting side? What technology are you going to be using? How do you now set this up? Different testing centers, if you are running a simulator. And the example that I put from a Gantt chart is an ALP that I did in my master's level, where we had to run a project, and the project had to be a simulation. And the simulation is, where the Gantt chart now comes into play. All the little color blocks that you see there, those are all your time horizons, meaning, how long it's going to take you. There's more detail that would follow, in conjunction with this, but it's basically speaking about your time frame, how long it's going to take you. Is it going to take you 4 to 6 weeks, 6 weeks to 10, 12 weeks, whatever that timeline is what you need to specify in your Gantt chart. All right. Then we want to talk about your supply and demand impact, scheduling, right? So when we're looking at it from a supply and demand impact scheduling, the first one we're going to speak about is production scheduling. And when we look at production scheduling, we want to look at a demand-driven scheduling. So, okay, let's take it back a little bit. What is supply and demand impact scheduling? So we all know supply and demand plays a huge role in basically any industry, because it directly impacts how you're going to allocate people, how you're going to allocate production, machinery, tools, resources, workforce, what is your different timelines, etc. So here, basically what it speaks about is the ways in which supply and demand actually does impact or affect scheduling. So when we speak about production scheduling, we're speaking about, for instance, when your demand is high, your production schedules must be adjusted so that you have more output, whether it means you're adding extra shifts, extra overtime, reallocating some resources so that you can meet that demand from your customer. Conversely, when your demand is low, your schedule is then reduced. There may be downtime, any way so you can basically avoid any sort of overproduction, right? Then we want to go into inventory management. And inventory management, we're going to talk on just in time, we're going to talk on inventory replenishment. So when we talk on just in time, a lot of businesses now follow the just in time principle. So your production schedules are very closely aligned with the demand for your product so that you have very limited and minimized inventory costs. So when your demand increases, production is then ramped up. When you have excess in supply, you basically want to try and sell that off so that you can reduce storage, you can reduce waste. Whereas from a stock replenishment perspective, your supply shortages can disrupt your scheduling. So basically, if your materials or component and let's say that's needed for production are somehow delayed. So when there's a limited supply, your scheduling must adapt by you rescheduling your production tasks or delaying your operations until you now have the resources become available. All right. Then we have workforce scheduling, and this is very simple. It's how your demand fluctuates for your labor, whether it's in different industries, let's say it's a retail or hospitality industry, your demand varies by the time of the day, the season, the event. You want to throw in more people if you're in retail on the weekends and after hours as opposed to during the day. So your workforce scheduling must basically be adapted to make sure that you have enough people and staff available during peak times, so that you also avoid overstaffing during off-peak times. Okay, so you're not just throwing away money. Then we want to speak on capacity and resource utilization. So when we're talking about resource utilization, it's how we're going to now allocate and use the resources. So when your demand is high, your scheduling must optimize the use of limited resources like machinery, like labor, like transport. So this can lead to bottlenecks. So you need adjustments in your schedule to ensure that any constrained work center that you have, they are utilized as efficiently as possible. Then we have seasonal demand fluctuations. So when we're talking about seasonal adjustments, many industries basically experience demand fluctuations based on a season. Like if it's a retail industry, they increase their workforce scheduling and stock replenishment ahead of like Christmas, etc. While if you're in the agricultural sector or construction sector, you adjust your scheduling based on the weather. um, whether there's any changes to the weather, and from a supply and demand perspective, that's where you would then change your scheduling perspective. Then we want to talk about supply chain disruptions. So if there's any disruption in your supply chain, whether you have a delayed shipment or you have, your resources or your supply is short, your scheduling must be adjusted to accommodate the lack of materials or the lack of parts that you have. So it may result in some idle time, it may result in rescheduling some of your jobs or your tasks, but this is how supply chain disruptions does happen. Even if there's a pandemic, for instance, it can cause either a sudden spike or a sudden drop in demand, not just from a local perspective, but also from a global perspective. So your scheduling needs to be adaptable so you can respond to those sort of changes within your production schedule. Then we have demand forecasting. So when we speak about demand forecasting, we want to speak about something that's quite predictive in terms of your schedule. So a lot of businesses use your demand forecast to predict what the future needs are in order for them to create a schedule that's quite efficient. For instance, if an airline might adjust their flight schedules based on historic demand data, they add more flights during peak period, and they basically reduce them when there's a low demand time. I don't think there's ever a low demand time locally, but it always does happen where there is a peak travel period. Like not many people travel on Christmas Day, for instance. So you'll see that the pricing on flights does reduce on Christmas Day, because people obviously tend to want to spend it at home with their families, etc. They don't technically want to be traveling on Christmas Day. So in essence, for the rest of everybody else, the best possible time to travel is actually Christmas Day because it's much cheaper. And then the last one is customer service and delivery. So you want to be able to have a delivery schedule. So a lot of courier services, like a DHL and a FedEx and a UPS, they adjust their delivery schedules based on demand. So when you have a high demand period, let's say it's Black Friday, more delivery routes are being scheduled. When it's off peak, you now reduce the services. So in the courier industry or logistics industry, we call it a scalable solution. So you either switch it on or you switch it off, and it doesn't cost you money to basically switch it off. Okay. And that is your supply and demand and how it impacts your scheduling. Then we want to talk about the importance of scheduling, short-term scheduling. So short-term scheduling obviously plays a very important role when we're looking at it from a day-to-day operations perspective, of any business, especially whether it's in a manufacturing industry, a service industry, a logistics industry. So you focus on the immediate allocation of resources and how best to sequence your tasks to ensure that your operations run smoothly, it runs efficiently, and it's in alignment with what your customer basically needs. So every business needs it. I am part of the logistics industry, so the courier sector. Based on that, we have a schedule on how we're going to conduct business on a daily basis, whether it's from a commercial aspect or a sales perspective. What is our schedule? What is our timeline? So we call it basically our pipeline. And we basically put a schedule together for each and every person. When we look at it from an operations perspective, you want to talk about timeframes. So when does the truck come in? When is it now clearable? Is it sorted? Once it's sorted, is it now scanned? Weighed, dimmed, manifested, all of that. Once that happens, then you're now shifting it through to a driver. What time is the driver going to get there? What time is he now going to bring collections back? So all of that forms part of a short-term scheduling that you would then run. As we said, short-term scheduling can be flexible if you can control it, and if there's any sort of like changes, it can quickly be adapted to. So the importance of it, number one, is you want to be able to maximize your resource utilization. So use the efficiency of your machines, use the efficiency of your labor, to their full capacity. You want to be able to properly assign tasks to the resources that are available in the short term, because businesses want to avoid as much downtime as possible. They want to ensure that they don't have overloading, which basically leads to smoother production, smoother service delivery, all of that. You also want to avoid bottlenecks so that you can basically identify any sort of potential bottlenecks in your workflow, and you want to adjust your resources so you avoid those delays. Critical resources like machineries and equipment, all of that needs to be properly allocated to tasks that require them basically the most urgently. Then we look at meeting customer deadlines. So by saying this, you want businesses to, your scheduling basically allows for businesses to meet tight deadlines and meet your customer demands. So by adjusting your schedule to make sure that their tasks are completed in the correct order, your businesses can deliver the products on time, which is quite vital for making sure that you have customer satisfaction and you also have that competitive advantage at the end of the day. So on-time delivery, making sure you handle any sort of a rush order, those are sort of how best you can meet your customer deadline. Then we're talking about minimizing operational costs. And with minimizing operational costs, you firstly want to be able to, reduce as much idle time as possible. You want your scheduling to be efficient so that your resources are always engaged in production. You don't want to have the downtime. You don't want to increase your operational costs, that sort of thing. And you also want to manage overtime. You want to manage labor costs. You want to minimize the need for having unplanned overtime because you're now planning your work in advance based on the needs that you have in your schedules. You can actually prevent excessive overtime as much as possible. Then we're talking about improving your workflow efficiency. So what is the optimal task sequencing? So in a production environment specifically, the order in which tasks are being completed can significantly affect your efficiency. So when you're talking of short-term scheduling, they need to be focusing on tasks in the most efficient way that they possibly can, making sure that the dependent tasks are completed in the right order so that you don't have any sort of delays. Okay. And then lastly, you want to enhance your flexibility. You want to adapt to any uncertainty that you have in the market. Whether you have an equipment breakdown, any machine failure, or someone doesn't pitch up for work, etc., you need to not be on a rigid long-term plan because it doesn't allow for unexpected events. It doesn't allow for sort of supply chain disruptions. But then when you're looking at it from a short-term sort of scheduling that is quite flexible, it allows a business to adjust the plans accordingly. When we're talking about enhancing flexibility, we also want to make sure that we'll be able to handle any sort of changes in demand. So whether it's a fluctuation in like a demand from a customer, maybe it's a seasonality change, maybe there's an increase in like hospitality, for instance, you can quickly make adjustments, and you can still fulfill an order to match the demand and prevent sort of overstaffing or understaffing at that time. You know, if there is a big match in like Johannesburg, or for instance, this weekend was the Ultra Music Festival, everyone from an accommodation perspective had to now increase or ensure that they have flexibility to change their plans from an accommodation perspective so that they can, cater to the hundreds of thousands of people that basically went up to Johannesburg this past weekend. So basically, this is short-term scheduling, which is absolutely simple to understand. If you do have any questions, I suggest you try to reach out to me, and I can answer them. But for now, I think that sort of covers us in terms of our Learning Unit 9. Next week, I will be forwarding you Learning Unit 10, and then we're done with content. Last week of the month on the 29th is when we're going to be doing our revision for our examination. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And once again, my sincere apologies for starting a bit later due to my laptop, but I'm glad we've now gotten this done. Thank you and have a good evening.